Today we are painting up the coolest dragon model I have ever seen, and wait until you hear about the price. Whether it's Middle-earth, Game of Thrones, Harry Potter, or hell, even Reign of Fire, I'm a bit of a sucker for the old fire breathers. A dragon enthusiast, you might say. From Ancalgon the Black to Smaug, whipping out some savage dragons on the tabletop is a big dream of mine, but the huge obstacle has always been price. For my Middle-earth gaming, I've been looking for a big special centerpiece for my MORIA army, but the old-school dragon by Trish Carden is out of production and far too small, whereas the stunning Smaug model by the Perry brothers is incredible, but Games Workshop would like both my kidneys before I put it on the table. Enter the coolest dragon I have ever seen, Revtath, from the Lost Adventures Volume 2 Kickstarter. This incredibly stunning sculpt was sent to me by one of my mates, Danny, from 3D Printed Tabletop, and it is absolutely phenomenal. The detail is crisp, the pose dynamic, and it has just the kind of presence on the tabletop I'm looking for, and it costs just over $20 US. This bad boy is of course part of the 3D printing revolution sweeping the miniature world, and this model and the Lost Adventures Kickstarter that it comes from has totally shifted my perspective on the hobby. In today's video, I'll be painting up the terrifying Revtath and playing with a bit of sexy LEDs to really bring him to life, and then modeling a full diorama display board to give him a nice home in the mountains. Once he's cleansed it of dwarven filth, of course. But before we dive in, let's check out a little bit more about the Lost Adventures Volume 2. The Lost Adventures is a different kind of 3D miniature Kickstarter that includes a collection of premium 3D printable miniatures, terrain, and RPG content made specifically for this set of printable models, making it easier than ever to use what you print with minimal planning required. Volume 2 follows up the immensely successful Volume 1 and has everything you need to get gaming in one package, as close to plug and play as possible in the 3D printing world, with fully pre-supported digital sculpts. The campaign features an incredible range of sculpts perfect for D&D or any fantasy tabletop wargaming, and as it is of course a Kickstarter, there are some serious savings to be had. All-in backers save up to 70% on retail price, and as a backer you will be able to vote for bosses and larger models to make sure you get your favorites like the Heartwood Treant, the River Kraken, and of course our very own Revtath the Listener. So if you're keen to check out some more of these amazing minis, terrain, and all the weird D&D stuff, check out the link in the description. I'm not getting any kickback or anything from that link, but it does show Danny and the Lost Adventures team that supporting me was worth their time, so definitely check it out. So let's dive in to the fearsome Revtath the Listener. My dragon was printed on a frozen 4K using the wonderful pre-supported STL files from the Kickstarter and has been cleaned up and was ready for assembly. The dragon comes in a selection of components that have lovely tongue and groove joints which really make her easy to glue together. As we're working with resin, I glued all the joins with cyanoacrylate superglue, and occasionally for those really big load-bearing joints I used a little bit of Tarzan's grip as well, just to give it some impact resistance. I ended up only having to pin the shoulder joints with brass rod because of the weight of those wings. Everything else just locked together beautifully with the tongue and grooves. Now, this print that Danny sent me was actually from a draft STL file before the sculpt was fully finished so that it got here in time. So Danny had warned me that a little bit of work would be required to make the log underneath the dragon fit perfectly with his claws. The STL up now on the Kickstarter is completely finished and won't have these issues, but this ended up being a very simple fix that completely inspired me to do some cool modeling for his base, which may include installing some bitchin' LEDs. More on that in a little bit. Once he's fully assembled, I used some VALLEJO acrylic filler to smooth any join lines, squishing it straight into the gaps, smoothing it with my scalpel, and then cleaning up any excess with a damp brush. I have to say, I found this whole process oddly cathartic, watching any little joins just disappear between a seamless line of filler. After a few hours allowing the filler to dry, I gave the whole model a nice even prime using Tamiya's light grey surface primer, and then it was time to rip into painting. Now, I denied a lot about scheme choice for this bad boy. I looked at going for that really classic green wyvern look like we see in Danny's concept art, but as I wanted to use this model with my MORIA force, who are already a sea of green skin, I wanted a striking contrast, so I opted for that classic Fire Drake of the North aesthetic of deep reds and blacks similar to the mighty Smaug. Now, Now we'll be applying a lot of contrast paints for our base coats in this scheme before we really bring them to life with some blending, so our grey prime is the perfect starting point. But for the fleshy underbelly and the skin on the wings, we wanted to bring in some of those skin tones a little earlier, so I gave them a base coat in KISLEV Flesh. For the hide and the carapace of the dragon, I decided to go for a two-tone scheme, keeping that deep vibrant red just to the actual scales, and anywhere there is spines or spiky accent details, that's going to be black. So starting with our reds, I grabbed some Flesh Tearers contrast, and then I mixed up 2 ratios of contrast mediums to give me a set of 3 glazing options for various parts of the model. Up first, we'll be using a 50-50 ratio of Flesh Tearers and medium to hit the fleshy portions of the wings. We want to apply this quickly and evenly, ensuring there's no pooling, but because the contrast is so diluted, it's much more forgiving when it's applied over flatter areas, so just try and minimize any overspill onto the spines and the wings, but this isn't a huge deal because the black layer is going to clean that all up down the track. Up next, we'll grab an even more diluted glaze, about 80% medium this time, and we'll hit the fleshy underbelly of the dragon. This more diluted mixture lets more of the lighter flesh tone come through while still tinting it, and it's going to set up some nice contrast for the scheme overall. There's so many amazing details on this model, even on the underside, and the glaze just eats them for breakfast, beautifully accentuating that recessed detail. On the broader skin of the wings, if any of the contrast pooling has occurred while it's drying, I just brought some of that 80% mix in and gave it a quick blend out, and with those washes down, we can see our fleshy red tones really starting to come together. Continuing with the wings, we'll now pick out all of the spines and the skeletal structure with another contrast paint, Black Templar. It's worth taking some care and maintaining some good brush control with this layer, as Black Templar is a very pigment dense contrast paint and it's quite difficult to remove any overspill. With the wing base coats looking nice, we're going to leap over to our big red carapace armor and grab some neat Flesh Tearers red and put down a nice base coat all over those scales. The key to this application is to keeping it smooth and wicking away any overpooling, but to be honest, the rib detail of this sculpt is just so lovely and crisp that the contrast paint absolutely loves it, and it creates a fantastic foundation for our red hide. Be sure to get in and around the ankles and make sure you minimize any overspill onto the fleshy underbelly, but if you do spill it over, because they're both reds, you can just wick that away with a wet brush and you won't get any noticeable staining. Switching back once more to Black Templar, we'll now put down a nice base coat on all of the spines and spiky details. These little clusters of black interspersed through the red carapace really break up the slightly monochromatic nature of the scheme. As always, be careful not to spill any on the red though, especially around all the little spines on the neck, as that's a pain to clean up. With our fundamental base coats down on the dragon, we're getting a bit of a feel for how this guy's going to look when he's finished, so now I'm going to turn my attention to the log that he is mounted on. Now, like I said during assembly, the print that Danny sent me was actually the prototype before the digital file was finished, and the log the dragon is clutching in his claws didn't quite match up properly, so I'd remove that large chunk of material to mount his left claw. So I've been left with a large hole to fill, and suddenly I got thinking, what if my dragon wasn't standing on some random dead tree, but what if this tree was a smoldering weapon, a huge trunk that he has superheated with a blast of flame and is now carrying into battle to hurl at the so-called impervious dwarven doors of Moria in a fiery impact like an insane battering ram. Its outer surface is a blackened, splitting bark, but its core is red hot, glowing with the searing heat of dragon fire. Now, does this make sense? Well, my half-complete physics degree says no, and my fantasy nerd says, who gives a f***? So, how do we make a glowing core inside our tree trunk? Of course, we jam it full of LEDs. So, I grabbed my Dremel, and I got the thinnest drill bit that I had, and I started deepening all of the crevices in the bark details that are already sculpted on the model. The tree has some lovely bark detailing, so it was simply a matter of following those lines. The LEDs that I'm mounting inside the tree are just some strip lighting that I folded over on themselves, running off a small battery, and they're activated by a tactical switch. I'll work out where those are going to go later. For now, we'll just shove them up there and make sure there's enough light coming out. I drilled a hole in the base of the tree, being careful to leave enough width to not damage the structural integrity and make sure that it can still mount to the base. And now with those LEDs inside shining through all of the cracks and deepened recesses, it looks pretty fantastic. So I gave it all a prime and then gave the other half of the stump that's still attached to the dragon's feet the same treatment. I'm going to keep the two halves of the tree trunk apart for now, and I'm going to begin mounting to my 120 by 92mm dragon base for Middle-earth SBG. So I drilled another hole into the base so that I can still access the inside of the tree from beneath with all my LEDs, and then glued and pinned it into perfect position. I pinned it using cyanoacrylate superglue and then soaked the contact joint with a 2-part epoxy. The epoxy didn't really bond that well, but combined with the pinning and the superglue, it's held together pretty nicely. Up next, I gave the whole tree a coat in CYGOR brown to establish that bark color. Now, with our LEDs up inside it, we can see the effect is looking quite good, but at the moment it's a tree with some weird holes and lights inside. We need to make these holes look like glowing coals, and to do that we need a transparent medium to take the light and refract it. So I grabbed some SELLEYS Clear Fix, which is a polymer-based plumbing sealant that you can get in a whole bunch of different brands around the world, but just make sure that the sealant you use dries completely transparent, and then I jammed that into all of the holes. Make sure you don't overwork the sealant, because the more you work it, it goes a little bit cloudy, and we want it to be nice and clear so that we can glaze it up and still have that lovely light coming through. And then I gave the wood surface another clean up once more with CYGOR brown to blend the edges of all of that sealant. Once again, I gave the other half of the tree the same treatment and then glued the two halves together, once again pinning the base, and voila, our dragon is standing on a base, no more holding him awkwardly from the claws. We'll be doing some more on this tree before it's finished, but I'm going to keep touching the tree while I'm painting the dragon because it's the best place to hold it around the base, so I thought I'd just leave that here for now and finish the big boy first. So back on the dragon, we're going to resume with our biggest layer, the red carapace. I'm going to be throwing 2 reds down into my wet pellet, Gory and Bloody Red by VALLEJO, and up first I'll use Gory Red to edge highlight every crisp hard line on the carapace, which takes a little while, let me tell you. Every edge of the scale is getting hit here. This is quite a broad highlight as it becomes our mid-tone. Then working straight into that wet Gory Red, I'll come in with some Bloody Red and do a finer edge highlight. This wet blending of edge highlights creates a lovely transition from our deep, vibrant fleshed hair as red in the shadows right up to our brightest spots on the edges. When doing this step, I move in chunks, putting down both layers of red on one part of the dragon before moving on to the next. With those reds down, the scales have a fantastic hue, but I really want to amp up the contrast a little more, so I'm going to bring in some AGRAX Earthshade and do a pretty heavy targeted recess wash. I am targeting the recesses on the large areas, those really big scales, but there are lots of small scales where I'm just letting the wash filter the entire section of the carapace. This creates beautiful toning and also adds some nice variety across the scales. With the red carapace looking absolutely ace, it's time to knock off the next big block, and that's our blacks. We'll be applying a similar wet blending process here. So first I'm going to grab ABADDON black and Stonewall grey and mix up a nice gradient in my wet palette. I want to mix a spectrum of about 80% black all the way up to pure grey. And then starting with my darkest grey, I put a broad layer down over all of the regions of the spine, leaving black Templar only exposed at the deepest roots of these spines. Then while that's still wet, I blend in a series of highlights, applying a little less paint each time. As we get to the lighter greys from the gradient, it's nice to apply our highlights to these rounded surfaces in little streaks running down the length of the spine. This creates not only nice blending, but also a bit of textural variation that makes these kind of spines look a bit more like a natural surface rather than painted resin. To finish them off, I apply a highlight of pure Stonewall grey to the very tip of the spine, creating that lovely bright point that accentuates the gradient of the greys up the spines. Now, if you like this look, you could simply leave it here, but to me, this stark black and red looks more like a Space Marine armor color scheme than the color palette of a real-world beast. Even though these spines are black, I want them to have more of a bony feeling, so I'm going to apply a thin coat of Skeleton Horde to act as a filter. This tints them beautifully, turning all our grey highlights to a darker bone, but still leaves the dark roots of the spines a nice browny black. The red and blacks are looking awesome. Up next is our fleshy underbelly. I'm going to give that a dry brush with KISLEV Flesh just to lift it up a little bit more and start building some more contrast into the scheme, making it really set apart from the lower levels of the red carapace. Then to finish off the wings, I dipped back into the grey gradient on my wet palette and gave the black structures on the wings a couple of layered dry brushes just to accent those raised details and frame the red of the flesh more prominently. Our final detail to paint is of course the eye, so nice and simple on a model this big. The eyes are actually big enough to paint. Throw down some white, do a big slit pupil with ABADDON black, and then give the eyes and the socket a nice wash with REDLLL FLESHTONE to give it a bit of warmth of all of those blood vessels moving through our large dragon eye, and then clean up any edges and overspill with some gory red. So I am absolutely falling in love with this model. The sculpt is just incredible, the detail's beautiful in the print, and I'm really loving how it's turning out. In particular, the carapace and the spines, and I've proper fallen in love with it. So much so that I've decided to rapidly change my plans for an upcoming Middle-earth tournament and put together an awful list headed up by a dragon and then a bunch of other MORIA goblins and stuff, which is great. But the kicker is that tournament's in 36 hours, so now I need to finish this dragon and then base him and make a display board for the whole army and then finish my goblins, which are just like in a sorry state as it is. So the clock is kind of ticking now, which is mildly alarming. And then on top of that, I've had a bit of a look at this color scheme and I'm loving the scales, I'm loving the spines, but overall there's too much red going on. My initial mistake of using the wrong glaze on this on these wings and this going way too red and way too dark, it's really come back to bite me. So what I'm going to have to do now is try and lighten these wings. Now, because we're not using an airbrush, that's actually quite challenging. So what I'm going to do, at least try, is a really heavy dry brush of a fleshy tone, almost re-priming it, and then we'll try some new glazes to try and lighten up the wings, and then we'll have a little bit more contrast in the model. And then I've got to finish the base, and then I've got to base the base, and then I've got to make the display board, and then I've got to paint the goblins. So, oh my lord, there's so much to do. Let's get cracking. So let's start hitting those wings with KISLEV Flesh. It's really important to take the paint completely off the brush to avoid any streaking, and oddly enough, even though this is a 3D printed model, I rarely had to worry about the direction of dry brushing. With the quality of the resin print, the layer lines were barely noticeable anywhere on the model, just a few zones on the lower wingspan. Once that KISLEV Flesh was down, I then mixed up a light pink by adding some white to the bloody red I already had in my palette, and put down another dry brush, and all of a sudden, the wings just came to life. There's some really lovely detail on these wing flesh regions, and now I've got the pink highlight hitting the raised details, the heavier glaze and the recesses really works as well, and it's all come together. With our dragon almost done, it's time to sort out these electronics. I used some more epoxy to glue the tactile button to the base, recessing it slightly within the hole so it perfectly actuates when the model is placed flat on the surface. This way, the model will light up when it's sitting flat, and then when you lift it up to fly it to its next resting place, it will flicker off and then turn back on again when you sit it down, which I just think is going to be really cool when I'm gaming. For the battery, I built a small little housing and magnetized that to the front of the base, drilling a second hole so I could feed all the cabling through. I'll sort out some sort of cover for this when I built the rest of the diorama, and I'm struck by some inspiration. Time for a bit more work on the tree. I grabbed some dark FLESHTONE from VALLEJO and hit all of the mid-tones and raised areas with an even layered highlight. Even though we'll be turning this to a charred stump later on, we want a little bit of that original vibrancy of the bark colors so that we have something to dull back. Next for the woodwork was a subtle dry brush with earth from VALLEJO to really accentuate the texture of the wood grain in the sculpt. To give the sealant obscuring these LEDs a little tint, I hit it just with some orange acrylic ink, just cheap stuff from the craft store, and that gave it just a little bit of a nice toning. And then to finish off the stump, I hit the entire surface with a wash of NULN oil by Citadel, though I kept that from darkening the sealant too much, as we want as much light coming through as possible. So that is Revtath the Listener completely painted, and I'm really happy with the scheme. I love the Fire Drake vibes, and I'm pretty tempted to maybe paint up a second in the future, especially as they're so cheap. Just $20 worth of resin for this guy, which is just mind-blowing to me, coming from the traditional expensive wargaming landscape that I'm used to. So if you're keen to check out Revtath and all of the other amazing minis and terrain, hit up that link to the Lost Adventures Kickstarter down in the description, and let me know in the comments if you see any other cool characters or pieces over there on the Kickstarter that you'd love to see me adapt to Middle-earth. Maybe we can bug Danny and get him to send us another one. So it is time to get cracking on a display board. So first off to the sketchbook to mock up a bit of a plan. I love the theme of my dragon assaulting a dwarven hold with his huge smouldering battering ram, so I opted for a nice tall door similar to the east gate of Moria, with some sort of row that I could have dwarves pouring out to defend their kingdom and buy time for the fortress to be sealed within. I then found myself a photo frame that would perfectly fit my display cabinet, so roughly about 1 by 2 foot including the border. Next, I grabbed some 1-inch extruded polystyrene, cut it to size, and then sketched up my design directly onto the foam surface, opting to set my cliff face at an angle and set the dwarven hold into the back left corner to really help it form a nice backdrop for the conflict. As I wanted to imply a mountainside setting, I set about terracing the foam to establish a slope that I could build up later with modeling compound, working down from the foam to the height of the frame itself. I then grabbed some 2-inch extruded polystyrene and threw it through my proxen to cut out a nice dwarven archway. With my components assembled, I did a dry fit to ensure I was happy with the layout, and then grabbed a textured rolling pin and pressed heavily into the foam floor and walking rampway down the hill to give it some subtle worn flagstones. With a little bit of cutaway corners and some simple foam stripping, I added some little extra details to jazz up the archway and the inner hall, and to complete the stonework, I textured the back wall with crumpled up aluminium foil and lined the walkway down the gate with some brickwork. A little bit of fast bond PVA and toothpicks, and all of this is glued up, and I'm ready to get on to the exciting part, which is the cliff face. To create our lovely rocky detail, I'm dipping into my big tub of woodland scenic rock molds and grabbing a chisel and smashing them down to size. Now these things are heavy, so we're lying the whole display board on its side with the arch facing up, and then arranging a bunch of different rock mold casts onto the surface. To glue them down, I'm using high bond PVA for some long-term strength, and then a bit of hot glue to give me a fast grab so that they can stay still while I blend them all together. Just let the hot glue cool off a little bit before you stick it down, otherwise you might melt the foam surface. Once they're all tacked on, it's time for the most amazing terrain product on the market, modeling compound from Wargaming Scenics. This plus the cellulose fiber blend gets mixed to a paste with a bit of water and then mashed in and all around the molds to fill the gaps and blend the joins. After about 10 minutes in the Aussie springtime, this stuff goes hard, so work fast and in small batches. As it dries, run damp fingers all over it to ensure a nice blended finish, and because this is of course made from plaster, it just looks like one big seamless rock face. I've molded all the way around the edges of the cliff face and started to do a little bit of the lower landform as well. Now this piece we've made so far isn't actually glued or blended into the frame yet, which enables me to go outside and prime all of the foam stone components with a foam safe black primer, and then hitting it on a bit of an angle to create some shadows and highlights with a Rust-Oleum grey, and that begins the foundation of our stone paintwork. Just be sure when you're priming not to get any of the paint on the plaster rock face, as we're going to be doing some leopard spotting on that in just a second. To finish off the stonework, we'll give it a gentle dry brush with a generic light grey, focusing on really breaking up the crisp edges on the details, and then throwing down a big old black wash all over it. This is my new black wash mix using some Liquitex inks shamelessly stolen from Jez's recipe over on Black Magic Craft. Cheers for that, big fella. Now we get to the fun part.
This is where the fun begins.
To get some super realistic looking rocks, we'll be leopard spotting our plaster rock face. This technique involves mixing up a bunch of washes of different colors and dabbing them sporadically across the porous plaster surface. The plaster absorbs the washes and they blend and swirl together, staining and coloring the rock face in a very similar way to minerals of different pigments within real stone. I chose some darker colors than I normally do here and added a little bit of green, as I'm hoping the darker stone will look more akin to that dappled moonlight setting I'm envisaging for my diorama. Once those washes are down, your Technicolor rock face, credit to Patreon Kenny Gage for that joke, will look super bright and garish. We'll wash all of this down with a heavy black wash to push all of those colors into the undertones, and once that wash is down and fully dry, out of nowhere, you will have a super realistic looking rock face. Now we're done with the messy part of the painting, we can glue this piece into our photo frame and use some more modeling compound to blend the rest of our slope. Give that a quick undercoat and we are ready to jump onto the other super exciting part of the diorama, the basing. Here we'll be using a whole host of products from the Geek Gaming Scenics range, all of which are available to purchase on my online store, zorpazorp.com, and up first it's a layer of super tacky ready basing glue, smooshed all over our ground surface. Apply this pretty heavily and wait for it to go tacky before we start dipping any stuff into it. The edges will go glossy on the sides and then you'll know it's ready. Our foundation of our surface ground covers will be a heavy sprinkling of the Scrublands Base Ready. This is a lovely aggregate blend of soils, rocks and flocks that is the perfect starting point for our mountain slope. To bring in a little bit of that alpine moss vibe, I'm then sprinkling in some green blend foam flock, which acts as a nice bonding layer as well because it'll soak up any glues or sealants and that'll lock down all of the larger aggregates. Then a few grass tufts sporadically through the landscape, especially up against the stone pathway, and then we're ready for our first layer of sealant. To lock this all down, we give it a good spray with isopropyl alcohol and then soak it in matte scenic sealant. This is a PVA varnish blend that will use the capillary action of the isopropyl to penetrate right down into the bottom layers of the flocks and aggregates. Now, I did say that this was an alpine hillside, so you can bet we're bloody using some beautiful snow effects, but then I was struck by a bolt of inspiration. The greatest thing about snow is that it melts under fire, so why not try and really seat our dragon even more in this landscape by trying some burn effects. So I grabbed my absolute favorite base ready Grimdark City Rubble, which I'm used to sprinkling all over my 40k Necrons, and I'd sprinkled a long strip of it through the scrublands and up onto the roadway so that it acted like blackened ash and stones. It got caught in the tufts and the flocks and it really just looked like burnt ground cover. I then dabbed a brush into the base ready mixture to pick up some of the black pigment and heavily overbrush that onto a stonework just like you would do with a weathering powder, and by golly it just looked fantastic. Then all we have to do is not let any snow fall on that area and the effect will really sell. So for our snow, we'll be using two different materials. First up is the snow powder base ready. This is a literal powder and is a little darker in color than pure white and looks amazing for melted snow. And then we've got the 1mm snow static grass, which is bright and crisp and perfect for fresh snowfall or snow with a little bit of sparkle. So I'm going to sprinkle little clumps of our powder all over the hillside. I want the snow to look like it's fallen a while ago and begun to melt, allowing our beautiful ground covers to shine through and create a stunning dappled patchwork of textures and colors. Then I'm going to grab some of my 1mm snow fiber and just sprinkle it on the top of some of the largest clumps to represent the light catching the tops of those little peaks and shimmering beautifully. Then I threw a couple of grass tufts and a little bit of green blend flock on our rock face and gave it a lovely snow treatment as well. If you hold the board on about a 30-degree angle, you can get a lovely cover on the rock face as you sprinkle your snow that reads beautifully and still looks like realistic snowfall. And with that, our display board is done. All that remains is to seal it like crazy. Absolutely soak it in matte scenic sealant. I did 4 or 5 passes, allowing it to fully dry in between. Before our diorama is fully done, we of course need to base our dragon to match this incredible landscape. First up, I made a little cover for our battery casing, and I decided to turn it into a rock matching our cliff face. I glued on some smaller rock molds onto the side, blended them all together with modeling compound, and then leopard spotted it and put it to the side. After giving the whole dragon a good coat in matte varnish, I wanted to finish off our smoldering tree by once again heavily dry brushing grimdark city rubble to act as a weathering powder and give it that really ashen surface. Now the ash look combined with those LEDs really tells a story which should strike up many conversations across the tabletop. Then I based our dragon to match the rest of the board, borrowed some dwarves from my mate Evan for him to roast alive, and there we have a truly awesome display piece for an absolutely phenomenal model. Well, that was quite a journey, guys. As you're watching this video, I'll literally be driving up to the tournament with the display board balancing precariously on my passenger seat, and I'm so excited to get Revtath down on the table, an amazing model, and I'm really proud of the whole scenic piece. Be sure to check out the link in the description to the Lost Adventures Volume 2 Kickstarter to have a gander at the amazing package of minis, terrain, and RPG elements, all pre-supported and just desperate to get on your gaming table, and let me know what you think of my fire breather. Would you like to see him roast some dwarves on the channel anytime soon? Hopefully he doesn't just fly away every game when he takes a wound tomorrow. A huge thanks to Danny and the team for giving me the chance to be involved in this project. Be sure to like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time right here on Zorp Gaming. Cheers, guys.